Welcome to this session on Aristotle's Poetics. This session would focus on Aristotle's view on mimesis, his defense of art, his definition of tragedy, and so on. Aristotle combined in himself the romantic sensibility as well as the practical wisdom, alertness, and objectivity of a persevering scientist. He was the pioneer and true father of Western literary criticism. The Poetics is a collection of lecture notes collected by his disciples. The Poetics is in part Aristotle's response to his teacher Plato, who argues in the Republic that poetry is imitation of mere appearances and is thus misleading and morally suspect. Aristotle approaches literary texts as a natural scientist, carefully accounting for the features. Rather than concluding that poets should be banished from the perfect society, as does Plato, Aristotle attempts to describe the social function and the ethical utility of art. Aristotle's view on mimesis. Art is not mere mimicry, but an act of imaginative recreation, whereby the poet, drawing his material from the phenomenal world, makes something new out of it. He equates poetry with music as it reproduces the higher reality with the passions and the emotions of men through language, rhythm, and harmony. The musician imitates through rhythm and harmony, hence, poetry is closer to music than painting. The objects of poetic imitation are men in action, men as they are and as they ought to be. The poet recreates reality creatively and brings order out of chaos. According to Aristotle, artists do not imitate but represents the reality and thus takes us closer to reality. Art teaches effectively and it teaches truth. The only way of acquiring knowledge at all, according to Aristotle, was through the senses, and hence developing, exercising, and sharpening those senses through art was healthy, not deceptive or weakening. So, on metaphysical grounds, art is conducive for an ideal society. On political grounds, too, art has a distinctive social function. Using an analogy from medicine, he describes the concept of catharsis. The word catharsis in Greek means purification. Through the representation of pitiable and fearful incidents, art evokes pity and fear in the audience, reader, and thereby purges the heart of those emotions. Just as a surgeon cleans and drains the wound with a lance, art too purges the human mind as the spectator or the reader feels pity for the tragic hero and fear for themselves. Thus, art has a useful and humanizing effect. And hence, art is neither psychologically destabilizing nor politically destructive. In the Poetics, Aristotle presents the principles of artistic composition. While the work treats many forms of imaginative recreation, including comedy, epic, dialogue, and even music and dance, it focuses most particularly on the elements of tragedy. Tragedy, according to Aristotle, originated in a festival of the wine goddesses Dionysus, and comedy evolved from a religious procession prevalent in the villages in ancient Greece. By his time, the golden age of tragedy was over. Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides were part of history. Aristotle was describing or examining their tragedies and gave guidelines for great tragedy. He was not prescribing rules. He begins his discussion by establishing a general definition of poetry. The essential feature of all forms of poetry is they are all modes of imitation or mimesis. Aristotle identifies three aspects in which poetic genres can be distinguished from each other: the medium through which they present their imitation, the objects of imitation, and the mode or manner of imitation. Tragedy emerged from dithyrambic poetry, and comedy developed out of the phallic songs performed at festivals of Dionysus. Tragedy is an imitation of an action that is serious, complete, and of a certain magnitude, in language embellished with each kind of artistic ornament, the several kinds being found in separate parts of the play in the form of action, not of narrative, through pity and fear, effecting the proper purgation of these emotions. Tragedy employs pleasing language. It is characterized by action rather than narration, and it achieves through pity and fear what is known as catharsis or purgation. He gives a beautiful definition for tragedy. First, he says it's an imitation. Imitation of what? It's an imitation of an action. And then he moves on to explain what kind of action is imitated. That is serious, complete, and of a certain magnitude. And such an action is imitated. And how is it represented? It is represented in language, which is embellished with each kind of artistic ornament. There are literary devices used, and the several kinds being found in separate parts of the play. How? In the form of action, not in the form of narration. If it is in the narrative form, it becomes an epic. So, in a tragedy, these parts are in the form of action. And what is the function? Through pity and fear, it creates or it purges those emotions. So that is the function, the catharsis. According to Aristotle, there are four kinds of tragedy. Complex tragedy, which involves peripeteia and anagnorisis, the tragedy of suffering, the tragedy of character, which traces the hero's characteristic traits, and the fourth one, the tragedy of spectacle, which depends upon scenic effects. Aristotle talks about three different kinds of plots: simple plot, complex plot, and plots based on the depiction of suffering. The simple plot represents a change of fortune which does not come about through a reversal of the situation and does not involve recognition on the part of the hero. In the complex plot, the change of fortune emerges out of the necessity from the events preceding it. It is brought about through a reversal of the situation or recognition or both. Aristotle seems to refine his categories of plot in later chapters, listing the complex plot which turns on peripeteia and anagnorisis, and the pathetic plot in which characters are motivated by passion, the ethical plot in which an ethical sense propels the action, and the simple plot which does not contain peripeteia or anagnorisis. Aristotle clearly favors complex plots which combine all the poetic elements to good effect. In terms of the progression of the plot, Aristotle divides the tragedy into two parts: the complication and the denouement or unraveling. The complication extends from the beginning of the play to the moment of peripeteia and anagnorisis, the turning point of the plot. The denouement includes the turning point and extends to the conclusion of the play. For example, the play Oedipus Rex by Sophocles. The complication starts with the murder of Lais, and then it moves towards peripeteia when the messenger arrives from Corinth and there is a sudden reversal of the situation, and it leads to the climax and anagnorisis when Oedipus finds out something shocking, a sudden discovery of something shocking, that he has married his own mother and killed his own father, and that leads to the denouement where he goes to exile. That is the resolution, the departure of Oedipus and the end of the plague in that city. One of the components of the complex plot, the reversal of the situation, is an event that occurs contrary to our expectations and that is therefore surprising. but that nonetheless appears as a necessary outcome. The Greek term for this reversal of fortune or reversal of the situation is called peripetia. Anagnorisis is a Greek term for recognition, another component of the complex plot, and describes the often sudden revelation, such as Oedipus' discovery that he has, despite his efforts to avoid it, to fulfill the prophecy that he will kill his father and marry his mother, that propels a tragedy to its conclusion. The presence of either peripetia or anagnorisis makes a plot complex. But Aristotle indicates that in the most successful plots, both are not only present but also simultaneous. Aristotle remarks again that tragic heroes and the audiences of tragedies experience peripetia and anagnorisis as surprises. Aristotle talks about three different kinds of plots: simple plot, complex plot, and plots based on the depiction of suffering. The simple plot represents a change of fortune which does not come about through a reversal of the situation and does not involve recognition on the part of the hero. In the complex plot, the change of fortune emerges out of the necessity from the events preceding it. It is brought about through a reversal of the situation or recognition or both. Aristotle seems to refine his categories of plot in later chapters, listing the complex plot which turns on peripetia and anagnorisis, and the pathetic plot in which characters are motivated by passion, the ethical plot in which an ethical sense propels the action, and the simple plot which does not contain peripetia or anagnorisis. Aristotle clearly favors complex plots which combine all the poetic elements to good effect. One of the components of the complex plot, the reversal of the situation, is an event that occurs contrary to our expectations and that is therefore surprising, but that nonetheless appears as a necessary outcome. The Greek term for this reversal of fortune or reversal of the situation is called peripetia. Anagnorisis is a Greek term for recognition, another component of the complex plot, and describes the often sudden revelation, such as Oedipus' discovery that he has, despite his efforts to avoid it, to fulfill the prophecy that he will kill his father and marry his mother, that propels a tragedy to its conclusion. The presence of either peripetia or anagnorisis makes a plot complex. But Aristotle indicates that in the most successful plots, both are not only present but also simultaneous. Aristotle remarks again that tragic heroes and the audiences of tragedies experience peripetia and anagnorisis as surprises. Character includes all qualities we associate with individuals represented in the play. Character is second in importance after plot. Tragedies depict characters as they relate to the actions, which is the main object of representation. Characters represent their moral qualities through the speeches assigned to them by the dramatist. The downfall of a purely virtuous character is not tragic, only shocking. We might pity this person, but we do not experience the anxiety that results from our own awareness that we too are subject to the loss that brings about the fall of a truly tragic hero. The triumph of a villain is likewise not tragic because it inspires neither pity nor fear. No more tragic is the downfall of a completely despicable character, satisfying though it may be, because we fail to identify with the character. Identification seems to be key to Aristotle's theory, for pity is aroused by unmerited misfortune, fear by the misfortune of a person like ourselves. For Aristotle, the tragic hero must be a person of high stature who is neither faultless nor deprived, whose misfortune arises through a terrible mistake. The main character should be good, consistent, and should have likeness. And if the person is inconsistent, he should be consistently inconsistent. Aristotle explains that audiences do not like, for example, villains making fortune from misery in the end. It might happen though and might make the play interesting. Nevertheless, the moral is at stake here, and the morals are important to make people happy. And moreover, the characters should be appropriate. If a character is supposed to be wise, it is unlikely he is young, supposing wisdom is gained with age. And if a person is a soldier, he is unlikely to be scared of blood. If the soldier is scared of blood, it must be explained and play some role in the story to avoid confusing the audience. It is also good if a character doesn't change opinion that much. If the play is not driven by who characters are, but by what they do, audience is confused in case of unexpected shifts in behavior of the characters. If a character always behaves foolishly, it is strange if he suddenly becomes smart. In this case, it would be good to explain such change, otherwise the audience may be again confused. If character changes opinion a lot, it should be clear he is a character who has this trait, not a real life person. This is also to avoid confusion. The behavior of characters must be suitable for their social rank. Characters must be believable. Attributes assigned to characters must conform to what would be expected from the same kinds of person in real life. The kinds of behaviors assigned to a character must not change suddenly and inexplicably. If a character is meant to be represented as indecisive, erratic, or otherwise inconsistent, this inconsistency must be consistently portrayed. Aristotle cautions his readers to understand the characters presented in comedy as more ridiculous than evil. The defects of these characters do not necessarily lead to pain or destruction. He later on defines a tragic hero as an intermediate kind of person, not predominantly virtuous and just, whose misfortunes, however, is brought upon by him by some error of judgment or hamartia. The best example is King Oedipus. Hamartia conveys the sense of missing the mark and does not indicate some predisposition to a particular crime. In order for a character's fate to fill us with pity and fear, we must recognize that we ourselves might commit a similar error in judgment where we in a similar situation like that of the character. A.Z. Bradley translated it as tragic flaw. It is not a moral failure but an error in judgment. Maybe the character was in anger, or maybe because of rashness in behavior, they might arouse an error in judgment. The meaning of thought is more elusive, but it seems to indicate the processes of reasoning that lead characters to behave as they do. Thought comprises both the rational processes through which characters come to decisions as represented in the drama, as well as the values put forward in the form of maxims and proverbs. All mental activities portrayed by the speeches of characters in the drama fall into the category of thought. Song refers to the vocal compositions incorporated into the performance. Music is described as an embellishment of language. The lines assigned to the chorus in a tragedy are usually conveyed in song. accompanied by rhythmical movement. The chorus, too, should be regarded as one of the actors. It should be an integral part of the whole and share in the action. This chorus is the best example of songs in a play. Diction refers to the metrical composition of the spoken lines, the way language is used to convey the representation. Aristotle identifies several categories into which the words used in tragedies can be separated: current words, strange words, metaphors, ornamental words, and altered words. Current words are those spoken by persons living in the region in which the tragedy is composed and performed. But on the other hand, strange words are foreign words or loan words. The meanings of most of these designations are obvious. Spectacle includes the costuming of the actors, the scenery, and all other aspects that contribute to the visual experience of the play. Aristotle lists spectacle last in order of importance, pointing out that the power of the tragedy is not fully dependent upon its performance. We can read a tragedy and still appreciate its message. He says that the art of the spectacle really belongs to the set designer and not the poet who has written that play. Next topic is Deus Machina. Both character and plot must be consistent and develop in ways that conform to the laws of probability. He restricts the famous theatrical device of Deus Machina, or the god from machine, from taking part in the plot itself. The gods should not intervene to resolve an impossibly complicated plot. They can, however, appear to cast judgment on the characters once the plot has come to its necessary conclusion. The classical unities or three unities are rules for drama derived from a passage in Aristotle's Poetics. In their neoclassical form, they are as follows. The unity of action. A play should have one main action that it follows with no or few subplots. The unity of action limits the supposed action to a single set of incidents which are related as cause and effect, having a beginning, middle, and end. No scene is to be included that does not advance the plot directly. No subplots, no characters who don't advance the action. The unity of place, that is, a play should cover a single physical space and should not attempt to compress geography, nor should the stage represent more than one place. According to the unity of place, the setting of the play should have one place only. The last one, the unity of time, that is, the action in a play should take place over no more than 24 hours. Aristotle does not mention the neoclassical unity of place at all, but it was later attributed to him. The next topic that Aristotle discusses in Poetics is the difference between poetry and history. It is not sufficient for a poet simply to record events as they happen. Such a chronicle is actually history but not poetry. Even if history were cast into the same kind of meter as is used in tragedy, Aristotle argues it would only be history in verse. A poet should be the maker of plots rather than just writing in verses. For plots, more than merely organizing events into a coherent structure, serve to represent the universal laws of probability. The true difference between historians and poets is that the former records what has happened, while the latter represents what may happen. Poetry is more philosophical than history, according to Aristotle, because in order to unfold a plot in a manner that is convincing to the audience, the poet must grasp and represent the internal logic, the necessity, the outcome of those events. Next, Aristotle differentiates epic and tragedy. Epic poetry is limited to one kind of meter, that is hexameter, and is in narrative in form. The events depicted in an epic can also span a long period of time, while the tragedy treats events that take place in a time not much longer than a full day, that is, one revolution of the sun. All elements of epic poetry, including the idealization of the characters, are found in tragedy, but tragedy does not share all of its formal elements with the epic. The narrative medium of the epic allows for the depiction of events that occur simultaneously, an impossibility for tragedy within the conventions of ancient Greek stagecraft. Homer gets high praise here for knowing his place as regards his role as a narrator. Unlike many epic poets, he speaks comparatively little in his own voice, allowing his characters to advance the story through dialogue and speeches. In a famous passage, Aristotle admires Homer's capacity to lie and offers a sophisticated theory of fiction, arguing that poets should strive for probable impossibilities rather than improbable possibilities. One of Aristotle's examples of a probable impossibility is Odysseus' arrival in Ithaca while asleep. The suggestion seems to be that if a poet can successfully establish a fabulous or uncanny series of events, we as readers will be more willing to suspend our disbelief than if the poet represented ordinary actions in a strained, unconvincing manner. Aristotle concludes the Poetics by reflecting on the question, which is better, tragedy or epic? Tragedy, Aristotle again argues, is superior to epic. Tragedy contains all the elements of the epic but manages to present its story in a much shorter span of time and with a greater degree of unity. The concentration of the tragic plot heightens its impact on the audience. Aristotle's emphasis on unity returns here in his conclusion too. The best epics, the Iliad and Odyssey, although composed of many episodes, tell essentially a single coherent story. Aristotle concludes by suggesting that different genres produce different kinds of pleasure. The pleasure of the epic lies in its episodic, diverting story, while the more intense and higher in terms of social value, pleasure produced by the tragedy is catharsis, the mysterious purging of our emotions of pity and fear when we witness the unfolding of a tragedy. Aristotle lays out the terms in which poetry can be evaluated. His approach to criticism is corresponding to his basic assumption that all art is mimetic. Many of his remarks address the success of a work in representing the perceived reality. Faults in poetic works can be organized into two general categories according to him. Essential faults that impair the work as a whole, and accidental faults such as factual errors that may be irritating, distracting, and disappointing, but do not indicate a failure of artistic skill. He goes on to cover 5 subcategories of faulty representation: impossibility, irrationality, moral harmfulness, contradiction, and failure to conform to artistic rules. Aristotle was systematic, scientific, and logical as a critic. Poetics is the first book to expound historical and psychological method of criticism. He was descriptive. His style is criticized as terse and dry. He makes statements but does not elaborate them. He is accused of always looking backwards, for he never wrote or encouraged young writers who might have been growing up around him. But in spite of all these minor faults, Aristotle is hailed even today as a man of universal genius, universal intelligence, the true father of Western literary criticism.